So, with the FRC having established networks as the dominant force in US broadcasting, who actually dominates within the networks? Well, the answer during the radio period, so up to basically the introduction of television in the 1940s, is generally NBC. It dominated in terms of the number of affiliates that it had. It owned two networks, so it had the red network and the blue network in every major market. It, through RCA, controlled most of the key radio technology patents, and initially, at least, it had exclusive access to AT&T telephone lines, which are obviously crucial as the basic infrastructure for networking. Total RCA revenues between 1926 and 1929 were $300 million, of which only 48 million came from NBC, and the relatively small contribution of NBC to RCA's total revenues demonstrates that, as far as RCA were concerned, the primary initial rationale for NBC's existence was to create programs which would encourage people to buy radio sets. So RCA's main job was selling radio sets. NBC was a means to achieve this end. From the inception of NBC, David Sarnoff, its general manager, envisaged that it would sell time in 15, 30, or 60-minute blocks to advertisers. So the way it worked was ad agencies and sponsors, that is, so commercial firms or from outside broadcasting, would supply these shows that were broadcast on NBC. They were usually made using NBC's facilities, such as those here at Radio City Music Hall in New York, and this would insulate NBC from direct editorial responsibility for the shows that it carried. The direct responsibility actually lay with the sponsors. David Sarnoff spent quite a bit of time in his public pronouncements trying to argue that NBC did not constitute a monopoly in radio. And he argued that those other radio stations who complained that NBC was dominant, those who were essentially complaining that they were unable to find an audience, he said that this was because they had no audience, because they had no service to render. It is the audience, not the station, which determines the position of the broadcaster in the air. So this is very much, again, the pro-market, kind of consumer sovereignty might be one way of putting it, viewpoint on broadcasting. That it's up to the audience to determine which broadcasters succeed, and broadcasters will only succeed if they are listening to the real interests of the audience. So Sarnoff emphasized in these kind of speeches NBC's public service outputs. We tended to focus more on the kind of their, broadcasting of presidential speeches, opera, symphony performances. He didn't so much, emphasize the advertiser-produced content. Sponsors were initially slow to grasp how to use radio, and it took some time to overcome a certain conservatism about ads. I think the point was that there was a delicacy about the idea that radio was consumed in the home, and about, if you like, inserting adverts into the private sphere, invading the domestic sphere with, commercial advertising. So, for example, in the 1920s and 1930s, you couldn't mention the cost of a product that you were promoting via advertising. This was somehow, so mentioning prices was just a little bit too overt. It smelled too much of the hard sell. Furthermore, the period after 6 p.m. was considered off limits entirely to broadcast advertising. And why is that? Well, because 6 p.m. is the end of the working day, and advertising is part of the commercial world, and therefore shouldn't invade, if you like, the non-commercial portion of the day, if you like, leisure time from 6 o'clock on. Obviously, that wouldn't last, that kind of prohibition. But it is interesting that, for about 10 years, advertising does not appear during what might be regarded as non-work hours. And the techniques of broadcasting specific advertising were very dependent on the print media model until the 1920s. The first spot ads, as opposed to sponsored programs, but just 15-second or 30-second or 60-second ads, these were simply text that was read out, as opposed to being basically acted by whoever is doing the readers. NBC hired ad agencies and ad agency executives as in-house staff as a means of selling radio to skeptics. So they tried to promote the idea that you could sell something through the voice alone. And they pushed variety shows where stars would literally pause occasionally to promote whatever the sponsor's product might be. And this led to a demand for a connection with Hollywood as a source of shows, because Hollywood was basically very good at providing compelling content that could be used to convince people, to listen to a show that was being sponsored by a commercial firm. But one of the problems initially with this was that when AT&T laid their telephone network that was used for networking, they laid it in one direction. It literally went from east to west. You couldn't go backwards on the same kind of signal. So it's only from 1936 onwards that a second set of cables were laid by AT&T from the west coast of the United States, where Hollywood was, to the east coast, where the radio market, or where the radio stations were actually based. And then from that point on, you begin to see Hollywood stars appearing in American radio for the first time. The first significant competition for NBC comes from CBS. This was originally launched as a station called United Independent Broadcasters, but this name was changed after a brief investment by the Columbia Phonograph Company, that is a record company. And the station basically starts broadcasting in September 1927. It had 16 affiliates. They're all pretty small, and in a way you could think of them as the stations which NBC couldn't be bothered with. So they're all NBC rejects. CBS runs into commercial difficulties pretty quickly. I mean, within a year, basically, it's already looking like it's on the verge of bankruptcy. So the response is the station turns to a guy called William Paley. William Paley was the supervisor of a show called the La Palina Smoker. And this is a show that was sponsored by the Congress Cigar Company, which in turn was owned by William Paley's father. Because the radio station that was advertising his company's product was on the verge of collapse, this was bad news for the cigar company. So Paley actually acquired an ownership stake in CBS and relaunched the network. Paley managed to convince Adolph Zukor, he of Paramount Pictures, to invest in CBS. And in June 1929, Paramount took a 50% stake in CBS for about $3.8 million. Zukor, for his part, saw CBS as a vehicle for advertising films. He was unwilling to advertise on NBC because David Sarnoff already had some kind of involvement with a rival movie studio in the form of RKO. Now, Paramount's investment in CBS turns out to be short-lived, but it does mean that CBS is able to acquire a couple of stars via Paramount, Ed Sullivan and Guy Lombardo. But in March 1932, Paramount finds itself in financial trouble, and in the bid to raise funds, it sells off its stake in CBS. In fact, it sells its stake back to CBS because CBS had done well in the interim. Paley introduces, strict commercial practices into US broadcasting for the first time. He demanded that affiliate stations were exclusive to CBS, so they only used a broadcast feed or a network feed from CBS. And he also insisted that they make available time for advertising as CBS demanded it. Initially, Paley tries to basically keep the costs faced by CBS as low as possible. So this is in the early 1930s. So this is reflected in the fact that he only offered affiliated stations 1/3 of the amount of network programming that NBC was able to offer their affiliates. There's a lot of, frankly, not terribly interesting content kind of as filler on CBS. So there's kind of speeches from government officials or from, God forbid, academics. There's lots of sports on CBS because it's still quite cheap actually to broadcast a sporting event at this stage. A lot of football, a lot of baseball. But as radio set ownership grew in the United States through the 1930s, so did ad revenues both of NBC and CBS. And so by the mid-1930s, CBS starts adding a couple of new shows, 1935, 1936. It's growing sufficiently that it's confident enough to do a stock market launch in 1937, so it's listed in the US stock market for 1937. And by 1938, from the original 16 affiliates that it had grown to 113 outlets. And ironically, in 1938, it had sufficient revenues to buy Columbia Records, the company which had originally given its name to CBS way back in the 1920s. But NBC is still 3 times larger than CBS, and CBS is still very reliant on cheap content. And it wouldn't be until really after the Second World War that CBS finally surpasses NBC in the ratings, and we'll see how this happens in the next set of lectures.